Russia has air supremacy, not even air superiority, because they can fly with literal impunity where they can fly without being attacked by the Ukraine side.
For Russia to take over the entirety of Donbass, it takes anywhere from 1 to 3 years to achieve that.
Because you have the net loss and the loss of integrity of the Ukrainian armed forces that is much weaker today.
I'm not willing to accept the idea that Russia's just, they're playing the long, slow game and they're going to grind the Ukrainians down.
It is irrational and immoral to continue trying to get a military success of any kind on the West, because it's not attainable.
This war, it's not a war between Russia and Ukraine. I think if the war was simply between Russia and Ukraine, that would have ended 2.5 years ago, if not beforehand. Now, this is a war between Russia and NATO. Well, it's a pleasure to have you both. So Lieutenant Colonel Davis, Lieutenant General Hodges, it's going to be a good discussion. And I'm going to kick it off directly talking about, actually, before talking about the peace plan, I think to understand the terms of the peace plan and what each side would accept, it's important to understand what's happening on the battlefield. And even there, it's difficult to really ascertain what the figures are, who's progressing, who's winning, how much is Russia advancing, what the casualty figures are. So my first question to you, and Danny, I'm going to start with you, is what do you make of the current progress that Russia's having on the ground, and how much progress do you think they're having?
Yeah, I think that one of the first things to understand is that this is not conducted from the Russian perspective the way Americans would conduct it, or anybody in the West with our military doctrine, et cetera. And that is that territory is a secondary objective, not the primary objective. What is the primary objective is the destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces, killing as many of the enemy forces as possible, kind of Clausewitzian kind of situation. And so on that regard, at least from what we can gather, and as you pointed out, it's always very difficult to get accurate numbers, what's really happening in terms of casualties. But it appears that Russia is achieving both its primary and secondary objectives, which is destroying the Ukrainian armed forces. And we do have anecdotal information from the Ukrainian side that they are having a very, very difficult time in the manpower issue and also on the territorial gains. And we've seen in October and so far in November, it appears that the Russians are accelerating in the amount of territory they're gaining. And I'm talking from Zaporizhia all the way up through to the Kharkiv region and everywhere in between. There's lots of places where they're advancing in a little bit faster location. So from my perspective and from my observation, Russia is continuing to go forward in ways that preserve their manpower and accelerates and highlights firepower so that they don't have these so-called meat wave attacks and all that kind of stuff, because they want to minimize their casualties while maximizing the other side. And the kind of the glue underneath all this is that Russia's not in a hurry. They don't have a time clock. However long it takes is how long it takes, but they believe that they can continue on there and they will win a military victory if negotiations don't end it before that.
Okay, I think the first point, and we've discussed this in a previous show together, General, what the Colonel is saying is that the primary objective of Russia is not territory, which I went back and forth with the Colonel in a previous discussion. If it's not territory, then why is that one of the key points in all negotiations, and probably the main sticking points is the Donbass? I'll let you respond to that, Colonel. But General, I would love to get your thoughts on the analysis by Colonel Davis, and maybe give us your take on the successes that Russia's having, if you'd call them that, on the battlefield, because they are advancing. Pokrovsk is about to fall. Ukraine is having manpower issues, but those advances are incremental. When I talk to different experts, they say for Russia to take over the entirety of Donbass, it takes anywhere from 1 to 3 years to achieve that, depending who you ask. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the points that the Colonel has made and the general question of how much is Russia really, are they really winning?
Yeah, I've been hearing about the fall of Pokrovsk now for over a year, and it was almost 2 years ago when they finally captured Avdiivka after a long year of fighting. And from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk is about 40 kilometers or 25 miles. So it's taken them a year to get there. Perhaps they will eventually complete the encirclement of Pokrovsk and be able to say that they have captured it at enormous loss of Russian forces as well as Ukrainian forces. And then you'd have to say, then what? What is the significance of if they do eventually capture Pokrovsk? Because I don't believe that they actually have the capability to fully exploit the way their grandfathers would have done back in the Second World War, to exploit whatever it is they've captured there in Pokrovsk. So I think that if you can step back from the map and the immediacy of what's happening in and around Pokrovsk and the other places that Daniel mentioned, this war has been going on about 11 years. The Black Sea Fleet, the great Russian Black Sea Fleet, not even a factor anymore. And Ukraine doesn't even have a navy in the traditional sense, yet the Black Sea Fleet is not contributing. The great Russian Air Force, with every advantage, still has not achieved air superiority. That's job one for any Air Force, and they've not been able to interdict convoys and trains bringing ammunition and equipment from Poland into Ukraine. So I think to say that it's inevitable that Russia's going to win, they just have to keep grinding on. Of course, what's happening at the same time, Ukraine has shifted their emphasis to attacking deep inside Russia, the oil and gas infrastructure. So if that continues, and if they get better at that, I'm not so sure that Russia will be able to continue paying for this war on into next year. So I think they are on the clock to an extent.
Daniel, these 2 points that were made by the general is that Russia, this is valid points, that even though they're progressing, they're advancing on the battlefield. That was one of the, you could probably say still is, but some would argue was one of the big military superpowers. And yet they're struggling with one neighbor that wasn't even a major military just a few years ago. They don't have air superiority. Like if you compare what the successes that Russia had in Ukraine versus, let's say, what's something recent, Israel and Iran, I know it's completely different wars. Iran doesn't have the support of NATO. But there is an argument to be made that the Russia today is very different to the Russia a few years ago. And if Ukraine continues those strikes deep into Russian territory, we have that strike by the attack and ballistic missile just a few days ago deep into Russia. If those continue, can Russia really sustain this war of attrition for another 2 or 3 years if a peace deal is not reached?
I think that's a really bad mischaracterization on our part, and I hear it all the time here. We need to understand a few things. First of all, let's go back to some of the things the general mentioned there. The Black Sea Fleet is not a factor. The Air Force has not achieved air superiority. I would dispute those. The Black Sea Fleet is very much incapable because they move and they fire missiles from their ships. So they have them moved off to places where they can no longer be attacked, and they're out of range. But then when they're ready to fire, they move out into the open water, they fire, and they go back to their ports. So they are very much involved in this. Rather than the air power, I would say that Russia has air supremacy, not even air superiority, because they can fly with literal impunity where they can fly without being attacked by the Ukraine side with these glide bombs and other attacks, and there's virtually nothing that can be done with it. So the Ukraine side is virtually powerless to do anything that Russia wants to do in the air. And this is not World War II, so they're not going to fly their planes over Ukraine territory where they would come into anti-aircraft capability, because they have learned how to use their assets to where the enemy can't hardly do anything. So that is one of the second issues. The other one, and maybe even bigger, is that when you look at the amount of territory, first of all, he said 11 years. This war has been going on in one form for 11 years, but in this form, it's only been going on only for 4 years, because the Russian army per se was not involved. Now they very much are, of course. Now, I will concede that the issue of how much territory they have taken, how many people they have killed, is much slower than you would think. But the big thing that I think is lost on too many in the West is this is not the superpower Russia against its one tiny neighbor. This is the superpower Russia against 50 nations, everything of NATO, all we could do with our intelligence support, our training, our money, ammunition, weapons, all of that has been draining our coffers from the beginning. And now that we're all on our side, much weaker than we were before, and Ukraine is still losing slowly because of the manpower issue. And the Russians have that. So they have calculated, and this is logical to me, that they're saying we can win this slowly, continuing to drain the NATO coffers. And at some point, this is not a mathematical calculation where you can do a linear calculation. Okay, for 4 years, they've gained this much. So to get the Donbass, it would take another 2 or 3 years. because you have the net loss and the loss of integrity of the Ukrainian armed forces that is much weaker today. And the idea that they could just continue on for another several years, I think is not sustainable. I think that the Russians have said we can take this slowly until they literally the fabric breaks and they collapse. And then the Russians have this much larger man pool because they didn't risk their troops. And the NATO side, if they want to do anything to where there could be a clash conventionally between NATO and Russia, Russia will be substantially stronger than NATO because we will have drained our coffers. But that's important to understand. This is not one against one. This is one against 50 in all of the support. And that's one of the reasons why this has gone slower.
General, I'll let you respond, but I think it's a valid point as well that the way we look at this war, it's not a war between Russia and Ukraine. I think if a war was simply between Russia and Ukraine, that would have ended 2.5 years ago, if not beforehand. This is a war between Russia and NATO. And if you take that in consideration and all the military support that NATO offered Ukraine, has Russia exceeded your expectation? I assume the answer is no. And then my second question is, Russia's still gaining ground. What would Ukraine need to do to turn things around on the battlefield? Is there anything that NATO or the US could supply? Go ahead, sir.
I really wish that NATO was involved in this and helping Ukraine in a meaningful way. You know, the United States equipment that we've provided to Ukraine, for example, the thing that Ukrainians really love is a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle that came into the Army's inventory about the same time I did and about the same time Daniel did back in the early 1980s. So we're not draining any coffers. The German army is growing thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Even the Germans have realized they have to grow their capability, to grow their defense industry. So I don't think anybody's draining coffers. We haven't. The problem is the Biden administration and now the Trump administration both failed to ever clearly define a strategic objective. Same problem that Daniel addressed in Afghanistan. We never had a clearly defined objective. And if you don't have a clearly defined strategic objective, you don't have good policies to do the things that need to be done. So, you know, we dicked around for years now about whether or not to provide certain kinds of weapons, and we did not kickstart our own industry. Finally, that's starting to happen. So the ability of the West to provide what Ukraine needs is really a matter of political will, not a matter of industrial capacity.
What would that be? What else should NATO supply Ukraine if they want to turn things around on the battlefield?
Three things.
If they want to push Russians back.
Yeah, three things. Assuming that they've made the decision and recognize it is in the interest of the United States and the rest of Europe that Russia lives inside its borders, just like everybody else does. If we've made that determination, then number one, of course, we increase the long-range precision strike capability of Ukraine by either investing in their own industry or providing more things such as Tomahawk or the Germans providing Taurus so that they could continue to attack Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, which is the lifeline between them and China and them and India, is that. The second thing, of course, is helping them from an economic standpoint of stopping these shadow fleet vessels that are going out through the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, carrying Russian oil to their customers in China and India. And then the third thing, Daniel's exactly right, Ukraine has very significant manning challenges, personnel challenges. And this is where I think we could be helpful in encouraging the Ukrainian government. They have to regain the trust of Ukrainian families that their son or daughter is not going to be sent off to combat until they've been properly trained, properly equipped, and put into a well-trained unit. These are the areas where I think we could be helping.
So the third one is training Ukrainian troops?
No, it's about helping Ukraine fix their institutional army, the part that recruits and trains and equips and sends soldiers out. Because right now, I think the reason you've got a problem with manpower is because you've got too many families are not convinced that their son or daughter is going to have a chance to even survive. And so they're leaving, they're avoiding it. And then you've got, okay. I think, so it's not about us training them, it's about helping them fix what we call the institutional army, the part that recruits, trains, and equips.
And that would allow more Ukrainians to join the army.
That would encourage,
more confident to join the army.
That's it. They would be confident that they're not going to be wasted. It's interesting, between all the different brigades, you've got some brigades do extremely well. They get plenty of recruits. People, I want to be in that brigade because they've got innovative leadership. nobody's being wasted, whereas other brigades don't have that. And so I think this is where the Ukrainian army could adopt, what we grew up with, the after action review, sharing lessons learned across the army to increase the overall capabilities of the army.
And one more thing, General, just on the first point, how big of a difference do you think Tomahawks would make in this war?
Only if there's a lot of them, and I can't put a number on
How
it.
many?
But if we said 10 or 20 or 30, that would be interesting headlines, but that would have no impact on the outcome. But if we're able to help Ukraine shut down Russia's oil and gas export industry by targeting those key places the way the Ukrainians are doing now, and also targeting drone factories, that sort of thing. So you're talking about a couple of hundred Tomahawks before you make a significant difference.
Colonel?
Yeah, a few things. First of all, I am in 100% agreement with the general on the fact that the West, and this goes from the Biden administration, NATO, the Trump administration, we have no strategy. We don't even know what we want to accomplish. We just throw a bunch of stuff out there, and especially during the Biden administration, we would delay when we would give all these different things and see how it was going to work, and then eventually give them into some level, et cetera. So there was never any connection between ways, means, and ends. We're going to give this so that this can be accomplished. We never did that last part. We just gave them stuff so that they can defend themselves. That's about as far as we ever went there. And if you don't even know where you're going, then how will you even know if you get somewhere good? Because you don't have a plan to get there. That's an absolutely fatal mistake that we've made. Second thing, though, we need to understand something that, in my assessment, in my observation, and I've had a number of Russian military personnel and people who've been at the front, really on both sides of this line. But of the ones that I talked to on the Russian side, there is a great frustration that they don't know why they're not doing these what we call big arrow movements, where they have the shock and all kinds of things, because they say we have hundreds of thousands of troops that aren't even in contact and aren't even in combat, that are in strategic reserves, et cetera, and we're not using them. That is because, going back to my earlier point, Russia has calculated that under the current conditions, they can slowly and methodically destroy the Ukrainian armed forces until at some point the fabric breaks, and then they literally can just take whatever they want. They can drive into the country if there's a collapse. However, if that changes, if the West did what the general suggested and said, all right, we're going to now give you a lot of Tomahawk cruise missiles, any kind of other long-range fires, et cetera. We start going after the shadow fleets in ways that actually do seriously impact their ability to keep the energy flowing, et cetera, and the money flowing in there. If it started to be an existential threat to the Russians, they would expand much, much greater in the operation. And then we would see the idea too many in the West have is that this is all Russia can do. And I argue it is definitely not all they can do. They can do much, much worse. I mean, I've only seen one use of the Oreshnik, for example. From what we understand, they're in serial production now, so they're growing this stockpile. Same with a lot of these hypersonics and several other kinds of categories. They could do a lot more. And if they feel that this go slow process is going to not work because now all of a sudden the risk is greater to them, then they will accelerate, I think, and then we may see that. So going after that is not going to be successful because it would cause another counter-reaction by the Russian side. And by the way, it would take, I agree with the general on this too, it would take a lot of Tomahawk and other kinds of missiles, because we've seen on the Ukraine side that Russia does fire a lot of missiles, long-range drones. Almost every night, some level of stuff comes in, and you see it still hasn't knocked the Ukraine side, much smaller, out of the war. So the idea that would work against the Russians is just not borne out by the evidence and the fact that Russia is much bigger. They have much better air defense capabilities throughout the country, which clearly is not perfect. And there are major strikes that get through, but it's minuscule in comparison. And if that doesn't knock Ukraine out, it certainly isn't going to knock the Russian side out.
Just one more question, Colonel. When you said Russia could do more, like using more Oreshniks, for example, what else could they do? Because they've already started pressuring NATO, extending even beyond Ukraine with the hybrid warfare that we've seen with the drones into NATO territory, the ship, the research ship that was near UK, British waters. So isn't Russia's been threatening about red lines for years now. What other capabilities do they have if, let's say, NATO offers more long-range missiles to Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a hybrid war that Russia's been doing. There's only been a couple of these instances where these drones have been flying. There's been no drone attacks or anything like that. So it's not really hybrid. They just flew in and unarmed ones, the ones in Poland, if that's what you're referring to, and some others that have been in the area, some aircraft overflights over Estonia, et cetera, which is not anything different than we didn't do during the Cold War. But the issue is always down to, is the Russian state able to handle the situation under the current circumstances? If they're succeeding, and they are on both their primary and secondary objectives, it's slow, but it is succeeding. But if that calculus changes, then they will also concurrently change because they have the capacity to do so. Just look at the rates of production from what's been reported. Again, all I can go is on public statements about how many ammunition they put with artillery, with glide bombs, and now their technological is advancing with that. Of course, the drones, other kinds of calibers of missiles, many categories. They are producing a lot more than what we're seeing on the battlefield, which means that they're stockpiling a huge amount, which the general mentioned, we're starting to belatedly go with our defense industrial base, but it's not a fraction of what the Russians are doing. And if there's ever going to be a conventional war between the two, they already have a decisive advantage, and they can sustain where we can't, because we're nowhere close to being at a wartime production level, and it would take years to get up to that level. So if we went too far, to answer your question, then Russia has leverage and cards to play that could increase the price on us. And if it comes to a war, it's just not going to go well with us. And God forbid, because everyone would lose, by the way. Russia, United States, Western Europe, everybody would lose if this thing expands. And I'm adamantly and passionately wanting this to get to an end for everybody's sake.
So, General, I'll let you respond to all the points. And the thing that I'm wondering is if you can give us an idea of what you believe the capabilities of Russia are, but more importantly, how they compare to the US and Europe. Because Europe is a bigger economy than Russia, yet they're being neglected by everybody, even in the negotiations. They don't have a seat on the table, which is really surprising to me. So I'm really curious, how capable are Europe's militaries?
So this has been something that's frustrating about Europe's unwillingness or inability thus far to combine its industries, its populations, its militaries, its technologies, its wealth. I mean, just the EU plus Norway plus UK together is about 13 times more than Russia in all of those categories, except, of course, nuclear weapons. So it really, Europe could do much more if it had the political will to do this, and also if it had the self-confidence. And this is why, of course, Russia is conducting these gray zone operations. I don't like the word hybrid, because hybrid doesn't sound like very significant. These are operations where they're launching drones, they're destroying infrastructure, they're conducting sabotage, disinformation, interference with our democratic processes, and it's a threatening. And Daniel said there was just a few drone out. Munich airport itself has been shut down 2 or 3 times already. This is enormous economic impact.
There's the Polish railway as well. Just a few days ago, that was blown up.
There's economic impact when you shut down airports, and there's been drones in at least 10 different European countries. Romania had to scramble the Air Force again 2 days ago for the same thing. So you've got the drone operations that are being conducted that are dangerous as well as disruptive. And of course, I think they're intended to distract European countries, to cause populations to be fearful of helping Ukraine. This is why the Russians are conducting these things. And I think also they're intended to create friction and strain between the nations. It's kind of weakens us. And the Kremlin can see that we still have not figured out how to inflict consequences on the Kremlin for what the Russians are doing in these gray zone operations. So I would not be too dismissive of them. They announced yesterday, I guess, that they're going to create facilities for 50,000 Russian tourists a year to go to Svalbard Island. Now, most people say, well, where the hell is Svalbard Island? But this is a part of the overall process that the Norwegians, of course, would be very concerned about this. It's this constant pressure that we have failed to properly address. Now, what's Russia's ability to continue conducting the war? I would stick with the assessment that I see in most places, that their economy is being artificially propped up, and it's on a lifeline from China as long as Russia is able to provide cheap oil and gas to the Chinese and to the Indians. And perhaps President Trump's tariffs, the secondary tariffs, on the two Russian oil companies. If those really are enforced, and there are some indications that India is already reducing how much oil it purchases from Russia, if these things stick, then I think you're going to see an economic impact next year that will make it difficult for Russia to not only continue producing the things that Daniel mentions, but also we've already seen in one of the oblasts, the government there, which is responsible, by the way, for paying these bonuses to people who join the Russian army, has already announced, sorry, guys, we're out of money. We cannot pay the bonus. So we'll wait and see how this plays out. The longer it goes, and this is the last point I would make in response to Daniel's points, I don't accept this, or I'm surprised how many people are willing to say, come on, this is not really the Russian army. The Russians are so good, which is what I grew up believing back in the Cold War, is how good they were. And that the only reason they haven't already taken Ukraine is because they didn't really want to. They're kind of just grinding it out. That doesn't chime with all the other things that President Putin has talked about and explaining this was going to be a special military operation. And what he has accomplished, of course, is Sweden and Finland have joined the alliance. The EU is finally waking up, and they're getting closer, too slow, but closer to actually using this 300 billion euro of seized Russian assets. And I think it's incredible how slow it's going, but I think they're going to get there. So I don't think that I'm not willing to accept the idea that Russia's they're playing the long, slow game and they're going to grind the Ukrainians down. Where I do agree, they believe they're winning because they think that we're going to quit. So that's what they're hoping for. I just think that their clock runs out next year.
Daniel, I'll let you respond, and especially to the point of Russia's what Ben called gray zone operations against NATO. Yeah. Doesn't that mean if that's the case, and I gave the example of the Polish railway that was sabotaged, if that's the case, doesn't that mean essentially in a limited manner, NATO and Russia are already at war, just an indirect war? You know, you've got long-range missiles and intelligence being shared by NATO. And more importantly, if this is miscalculated and we do have limited direct conflict, I'm talking direct hits by Russia and NATO, one question I have is, what are NATO's capabilities, putting nuclear warheads aside?
Yeah. So first, Paul, that last point there, just to be clear, what I'm arguing is not that Russia is not taking Ukraine because they don't want to. It's that because they are prioritizing their troops and that they don't want to have these big arrow movements with big casualties, which for sure would happen. So they have calculated it is in the most efficient manner to win the war, to go by this go slow, grind them down situation. And as we heard Putin say, I think just yesterday, he basically gave an ultimatum and said, you either come to a negotiated settlement or we will win this on the battlefield. So they very much do intend to destroy Ukraine and take it all, or at least take it politically. So that is their objective. And he said it again yesterday and put his name on the line. So we'll see how that goes there. Back to the gray zone issue. Interesting thing here that we're talking about how we're going to respond to them. And to your last point, Mario, does this almost mean like we're in a low level engagement already? Absolutely. 100%. And it's odd to me that we keep talking from the West primarily, and especially in Europe. We talk about how, oh my gosh, look what Russia's doing, and they're bad guys because they're doing this stuff. I don't know if these things have all been from the Russian side. There's conflicting information, but let's assume that they all are. Every one of them you mentioned, every one of them are from the Russian side. How can we be surprised? Because all of these European countries, every one of them are supporting operations to kill Russians on the battlefield. Why would anybody think that the Russians would do nothing in response to that? If we don't want that kind of activity, then we can't be literally supporting the destruction and the killing of Russian troops on a battlefield. If you want to do that, that's a policy decision that can be made. But don't be surprised when there's a counteraction. And that's one thing about Russia that we just don't seem to acknowledge, that they're an actor just like we are. And when somebody does something, we'll have a counter to it. So when we take these actions, we better expect there to be a counter to it. And these are the issues. And another reason why I'm so adamant that this war come to an end quickly before it escalates beyond this gray zone, as the general called it, or hybrid as others want to refer to it, so that it doesn't explode into an open warfare between the two. And in terms of war-making capacity, this gets back to the economic issue right there. When you just look at the raw numbers of the economies between the two, which you just referred to, without question, it's hugely in the advantage of the Western European countries. I mean, huge advantage. When you look at the number of airplanes, tanks, troops, all that kind of stuff, they all on paper are on the Western side, all of them. But when you look at what actually goes into sustaining and making war, it's basically logistics, and that includes the defense industrial base. And because of the Russian failure over the first 18 months, especially the war when they were awful strategically, operationally, and tactically, they learned through very painful lessons and blood and much loss what they needed to do. And they have made a lot of the corrections. And now then they have a defense industrial base that is able to sustain large scale operations for a long time. And it can go even higher if there is a war with the West, which is why the evidence suggests that they are stockpiling large numbers of ammunition. And by the way, it's not just about the tanks, planes, and artillery pieces, et cetera. Those are important, but it's the most important is the sustainment of ammunition stocks and air defense industrial or air defense missile, interceptor missiles, offensive long-range missiles, artillery, just regular ammunition of all their different kinds, and of course of the drones. Who can sustain the most of those? And the absolute sine qua non of everything is the personnel. Ukraine does not have the number of personnel. It doesn't matter how much you train them at this point. The losses have been too great. The people leaving the country has been too great. The desertions have been too great. There just isn't a corps under fire that you can now change that dynamic while the Russians already have it and are also increasing. The dynamics simply don't work. There's no scenario where this gets reversed. And that's what you have to have. You have to have, first of all, to stop even the slow go of the Russians, somehow stabilize it, and then move back in the other direction while keeping Russia from ever making any counter moves. And that's just illogical to understand and to think that that's going to happen. So that's why I say we need to take this best ugly deal that we can get right now, and it would be ugly, a negotiated settlement right now. But if we don't, the likelihood, in my estimation, is that we will see all of Ukraine conquered and until Russia just won, whether it's up to the Dnieper or anywhere else. I would only go to the Dnieper. I wouldn't even try to go further, but that's not my call to make. But they have the capacity to do that, and the Ukraine side doesn't have the capacity to stop it.
General, I'll let you respond to all the points and also talk about something you've talked about in other interviews, and that's the other lever that the West has against Russia, economic warfare. And we've seen the sanction packages, including the latest ones on Rosneft and Lukoil, probably the most impactful sanctions that we've seen so far. And they are hitting Russia's coffers. So maybe give us an idea of how impactful those are and why aren't they enough to at least pressure Putin to change his position on the negotiating table if they are such a strong lever for NATO?
Yeah, so there's a logic issue in some of Daniel's points. This idea that they're stockpiling, they have so much stuff. Why aren't they using it? I mean, what are they stockpiling, waiting for? If Ukraine is on the edge of breaking, why haven't they deployed these things so they could break through and go ahead and end the war? I mean, how was that in Russia's advantage to let this thing go on for 2 or 3 or 4 more years? Because I don't think they're going to be able to pay for it. The ugly deal. The ugly deal, of course, it's ugly because nobody on the planet believes that Russia would actually live up to it. Russia has never lived up to any agreement. Right after they signed, well, of course, Budapest Memorandum is one of the most obvious, but also right after the Minsk Agreement, they launched the largest offensive of that first part of the war in the Donbass region. And the Ukrainians know that the Russians will not live up to any agreement unless they are compelled to. Even President Reagan used to talk about trust but verify. This is who you're dealing with. And so the Europeans also can see that if this so-called ugly deal is jammed down their throat, that it's only going to delay another year or two, and then the Russians are going to start back up again. And so I think the idea that they should take this deal even though it's bad, somehow that ends the fighting, I don't think that is substantiated by analysis of who and what Russia is and what they have said. Clearly, Vladimir Putin is not interested in peace. What he's interested in is the destruction of Ukraine and the idea of Ukraine as a state. Now, why do I disagree with Daniel on that this could be turned around? Let's assume that Ukraine does what's necessary to address its manpower issues. There are about 2 million women and men of military age Ukrainians that are in Ukraine or else in Europe, women and men that need to be in the armed forces. So they've got to change the model of what they're doing to get some of those people back into the ranks. That obviously has to be done. Secondly, if the West realizes that, if Ukraine fails, it will be because the West failed, and you're going to end up with millions more Ukrainian refugees pouring into Central and Western Europe, which will have significant damaging economic impact for European countries. And then, of course, the Red Army is going to press tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers into the Red Army. So the Red Army itself will grow in its capability, and now you're going to have a Russia that is emboldened, and this war is going to expand. So a bad deal is not going to end the fighting. It only guarantees that there will be more fighting from a worse standpoint for European countries. Now, the economic tools, this is the leverage. And I really had hoped that President Trump would use this enormous economic leverage he had to end the war, as he said he wanted to do. And certainly, I believe he's sincere when he says he wants to stop the war. Unfortunately, he's wanting to stop it on the Kremlin's terms. The United States, if we use the economic leverage of helping to shut down Russia's ability to export oil and gas, use sanctions that are enforced, and find ways to replace what China and India, what they need, find alternative sources of energy for them, I think the impact on Russia's ability to continue to fight this war would be immediate. And then, of course, investing in Ukraine's defense industry. There are already some European countries that are doing that. That needs to continue. And I think we should, if we have settled on a strategic objective, which means Russia lives inside its own borders, then we do what's necessary. If we don't, the Chinese are going to be looking at this, and they are going to say, okay, the United States is kind of flexible on this sovereignty and this borders thing. And the United States seems to be slow in getting its defense industry going, and the Europeans are slow on growing their defense industry. That's bad news for Taiwan. It's bad news for the Philippines. It's bad news for everybody that is in Beijing sights.
Colonel, I'll let you respond to all the points, especially the last one about Xi and other leaders that have territorial ambitions being emboldened by a Russian win. And a Russian win means getting what they want in the current negotiations as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one point where I could not more strongly disagree with the general and his assessment in here. The deal, the offer between an ugly deal now and a military loss is stark and real and likely. So it's not that you don't like what's happening here and maybe it will result in fighting in the future. If that was the case, Russia wouldn't have to offer a deal now. They would just win. They have all of the advantages and the military and the military capacity right now. So if that was really what they wanted, they wouldn't stop. They would just go now. But they are still willing to have a negotiated settlement because, unlike what the general said, the objective of the Russian side is not conquering more territory. It's having peace on its border. That's what it has said since 2007, when we first started talking about moving NATO further to the east. In 2008, they said, this is a red line. Georgia and Ukraine is a red line. Our people knew that. We've had leaks of several American officials who understood that. And now then we've seen it graphically play out. And gosh, if you want to talk about who doesn't keep their word, how about what the United States and the West has done with 2014 and helping to overthrow the legally elected government in Kiev with the Minsk agreements, all the things. And we now know that we never intended to keep those. It was just to buy time for the Ukraine side. And now then we have in the offer for a peace in 2021, December 2021 to be specific, where Russia said and acknowledged by Jens Stoltenberg, the war could have been avoided if we just took NATO off the table, because that was the problem and the existential threat to the Russian, as it would be for us if Russia wanted to have a military alliance in Mexico. We would never permit it. Why do we think Russia would? But they knew that. We told them. We went ahead and did it anyway. Then the only reason, this is crucial to understand, the only reason we are at this deal where it's an ugly loss, an ugly negotiated settlement or a military loss, is because we abjectly refused diplomacy in April of 2022 in Istanbul. We refused it after the disastrous failed offensive in 2023. We refused it in 2024 when Putin again made that offer of the 4 oblasts, and we're refusing it now. If we refuse this one, every time we've refused it, the terms get worse for Ukraine. The losses get worse. You talk about the slow roll, but when you look at all the things that have added up over the time, it is probably in the hundreds of thousands of men who have died unnecessarily because we would not accept an ugly deal at each of these times, but it keeps getting more ugly. So if we want to do something that's rational, the hope that it gets turned around is not based on rational observation, based on the nearly 4 years of physical evidence that we have and the observation of what the capacity is for making war on the Russian side. To not take this deal now, in my view, is illogical and immoral because it is virtually condemning more Ukrainians to death and more territory lost to Russia. And at the end of the day, it's not going to change who's going to win. That's already baked in. It's going to determine how bad the loss is. And we're going down a path because we have failed to set an objective that can be attainable. We're now baking in, or at least we're heading towards something that would be even worse. And that is the core issue.
Ben, there's a few points made here, and I think we've started talking about what really led to this war. Also, an interesting point that the Colonel made is that the longer this takes, the longer these negotiations take, it's just the terms are getting worse and worse for Ukraine. They haven't changed much in the last few months. But if we go back to 2 years back in Istanbul to where they are now, it is becoming harder for Ukraine to keep as much territory as they would like. So my question to you is, first, I would love you to respond to that point, other points, and also talk about the role NATO played in antagonizing Putin to eventually invade Ukraine in 2022.
Yeah, well, Daniel, don't forget, Russia had peace on its border until it attacked Ukraine, a neutral country. It had peace on its border since the collapse of the Soviet Union. If there ever was a time that we were really going to be a threat to the existence of Russia was right in that first year or two at the collapse of the Soviet Union, when NATO was at its strongest and Russia was on its knees. What did we do? We disarmed. The U.S. Army in Europe went from 300,000 troops to 30,000 troops. We sent all of our tanks and attack helicopters home. The German Bundeswehr reduced by half. The British Army of the Rhine left the continent. So the idea that somehow we are a threat or that Ukraine joining NATO or a independent Ukraine on Russia's border is a threat to the existence of Russia, of course, is nonsense. The idea that somehow the United States or the CIA had anything to do with the overthrow of the Yanukovych government, I don't think is substantiated by any facts, knowing what we know now about Yanukovych's plan and what he tried to do with the police. So I don't think you could point that successfully at the United States. Russian peace offers in Istanbul and other places. Of course, Russia's peace demands are Ukraine, you disarm and you let us have this territory. That's not a sustainable peace demand. That is a Russian peace demand, but that's not a sustainable or justifiable peace demand that Ukrainians could accept, because they know what happens when Russians show up in their towns and villages. They understand that. They have history, recent as well as long history, and the Europeans also understand that. And these Russian peace demands are not sustainable or just, and so that's why they have been denied. So saying it real loud, saying it a lot of times, doesn't make it so. I think what we have to do is make sure, because this is about more than Ukraine. This is about Europe. This is about stability and security in Europe. And it's in America's interest. It's in Europe's interest that Europe is stable and secure, because Europe is America's biggest trading partner. So it's in our interest that this is stable and secure. And what Russia has done, unprovoked, is to attack a neutral country that has disrupted food and energy shipments, which jacked up prices for all of us, and has put millions of refugees on the road into Europe, which has added to the economic stress on them.
Ben, just before Daniel responds, when you say unprovoked, do you mean that NATO's expansion played no role whatsoever in Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, or played a role just less than what Daniel says?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me that I did not answer that part. So NATO enlargement, and of course, I think the ones that the Russians are most unhappy about were in 2001 when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined the alliance. But the first question would be, why would those three countries ask to join NATO at the earliest possible opportunity? Why would they do that? Because they used to be part of the Soviet Union. They were they were part of the Russian Federation and Soviet Union. And fortunately, the United States never even recognized the fact that they had been occupied by the Soviets. That was important to those countries. But they know what it's like to be under the thumb of the Kremlin. They know what life is like. And so to get into NATO as soon as they could was about their own survival. Same with Poland, which joined, and the Czechs and the Hungarians in 1999. It was about their security. Estonia was never going to attack Russia. Ukraine, if the Kremlin really thinks that Ukraine was somehow going to attack Russia, or that NATO was going to come into Russia through Ukraine, that's nuts. We had the chance, or the window was there at the end of the Cold War, and we did the opposite of being a threat. We withdrew, we disarmed, we made ourselves weaker rather than taking advantage of when Russia was on its knees. And in fact, we invited Russia to join the G7. We spent billions of dollars and Deutschmarks helping the Russians after the end of the Cold War. We had Russian troops with us in Bosnia in the alongside the NATO implementation force after the Dayton Peace Accord. I remember seeing Russian troops sitting next to our troops in the eating Thanksgiving dinner in a mess hall there in Bosnia. So we have tried for years to have some sort of a normal relationship with Russia. And what we have gotten is Russia invading Georgia, invading Ukraine, supporting the Assad regime and their chemical weapons, and then a large-scale invasion. So if we want peace, pull out, go back to your own country.
Daniel?
Yeah, this is, there's several things that were just said there, which is just flat out inaccurate, factually, just not true at all. Let's start off, first of all, with this, that Russia, there was peace between the two until Russia invaded. 100% not true. From the time of 1991, when the Soviet Union disbanded and Ukraine became a sovereign country, there was no conflict between the two. They were living as neighbors. They had their normal disagreements or whatever, economically, politically, whatever, but there was no conflict at all until we had the 2014, and you can't be honest and say anything besides it was a coup. And to say that the U.S. had nothing to do with it, I mean, there is lots of evidence that we do. Victoria Nuland, probably don't need to go much further than that. All the leaked documents that we had, the fact that there was an agreement between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, and Europe on the 21st, I think it was, of February 2014, to have early elections, which the Ukraine side, or the Western-oriented side, would certainly have won. They still said, no, we're going to overturn it. And they made Yanukovych fled, and they didn't have the early elections. We put who we wanted in there, and things went south. Russia still didn't invade that time. Ukraine, on the other hand, did move their troops into East, and they had a civil war for 8 years, and they used Ukraine troops against Ukraine citizens of ethnic Russian past in the eastern part of their country. Russia helped support with arms, ammunition, and other things, but they still didn't invade. They annexed Crimea. That was the first issue. Never would have happened without that coup there, first of all. Then after that, Russia stayed out militarily until Ukraine continued to move forward, and NATO, by Stoltenberg's statement, said we will eventually bring Ukraine into NATO. Now, you can't possibly say that there was no threat to the Russian side because we were disarming when we were moving NATO closer and closer to include the Baltics. And then we're saying it's going to be Ukraine too. I mean, that because once you move that troops in there, you have the potential for military forces, you have the potential for missiles, etc. Minutes, time flight. No nation would allow that. And to say, well, that's nuts that Russia would think that it's offensive. Would it be nuts if we thought Chinese troops in Mexico were on our border and said, oh, it's just defensive? We would never tolerate that. Never. And so I don't know why anybody thinks that Russia would have a different view, or that it's nuts for them to think that way. And the second, the other part about withdrawal, there was no withdrawal. There was an advancement of military alliance. It's not a political advancement. It's not the EU. It's a military alliance closer and closer to the Russian border. There is a big difference between the Baltics, which the Russians didn't like, and the Ukraine side militarily, because there is the Suwalki Gap, which I know that General's very well aware of, which is pretty easy to defend for the Russian side, and Russian NATO forces would have to go in a very narrow band. It would be easy to knock out. But Ukraine, on the other hand, is almost like an arrow pointing to Moscow in this open territory that if anybody wanted to attack, and the West has twice in the previous 2 centuries, they have history with that. So there's a reason why they would be threatened by that, where we claim that there's nothing. So you cannot say that Russia is acting irrationally. You don't like it, I get it. But again, I go back to this, which you just can't escape. It is irrational and immoral to continue trying to get a military success of any kind on the West, because it's not attainable. The losses on the Ukraine side have been too great. You can't overcome them. No training, no amount of ammunition is going to turn the tide, because Russia already has more of those than the West side is going to get in the foreseeable future. They already have millions more that they haven't even gotten into forced mobilization. If they're starting to have a problem with recruitment, that's not a shock, but it's also indicative of that Russia can do the forced mobilization, which Ukraine has been doing almost from the outset. And now then they don't have enough. They lose more through casualties, people fleeing the country, and desertions than they have bring forced mobilization in. So they're getting smaller, and the Russian side is still getting bigger. So there's no rational path to doing this. And to do so is to condemn Ukraine to death, politically and physically. That is the truth.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm surprised, man, especially knowing as much about history as you do and having been a soldier yourself. You have basically said, there's no way Russia can lose because they have more people, they have more stuff. Russia, the Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan, which is on the border of the Soviet Union right there. It had enormous advantage in population, industry, technology, everything, and they got run out of there just like we did. So
indeed, I do know history, General, and in that case, there was no threat that the Mujahideen were going to march on Russia. It wasn't NATO that was going to come in and put NATO.
It was
a huge difference.
There's no threat that Ukraine was going to march into Russia. All these
not Ukraine, NATO. It was all of NATO. It wasn't just Ukraine. That is a massive difference.
You served as an officer in Germany in NATO yourself. Do you remember exercises or plans where we were going to attack the Soviet Union? No, of course not, because all of our exercises, everything was based on defending against a Soviet attack.
And then going on offense. That was part of this plan. Yes, I do remember that.
It was always to reestablish the inter-German border. So, look, what's immoral?
Fair enough. That's what we had put on paper. But are you going to suggest that Russia should just trust that we would never do that when the West had done it twice in previous 2 centuries?
What is immoral? What is immoral is forcing Ukrainians to accept a deal where they have to accept a Russian demand that they reduce the size of their own forces and tell them, but you can also never join an alliance. That's the immoral part.
But the problem is that you're acting like there's a decision that can be chosen. We can choose not to do that. We can't, because if we have refused all the diplomacy in the years up to this point. Now then they're left with either this ugly deal or they will be defeated, which is worse than the ugly deal. That's the immoral part I keep talking about.
Yeah, the premise of your whole point is that it's inevitable that Russians go win, and I think there's enough examples in history, and what we've seen of the will of Ukrainians far superior to the will of Russians.
Golly, but what about the will of the Russians? It's very clear they have a very profound will.
I don't think so. Putin does.
Daniel, why would Russia want to limit Ukraine's military and not offer Ukraine any security guarantees if their goal is not to continue invading Ukraine?
If their goal was to continue invading Ukraine, they wouldn't need any of this. They would simply march until they get it all, which they can do. Their objective is to have security on their border. They actually mean that. They've meant it from the beginning. And so by having a limited number of troops, then they're no longer a threat to that. With no NATO, they're no longer a threat to that, i.e., this is a return to where it was from 1991 to 2014. That is the logic of it.
So this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. President Trump has complained about Europeans being free riders by not doing what they should do, even for their own defense. How can that be construed as, therefore, NATO is a threat to the great Russia that has all these
Well,
incredible
you may
capabilities.
recall, General, that there is a rebuild Europe plan, $800 billion. You mentioned earlier in this show about the Germans talking about they could be at war with Russia coming about 2029, so they have to build up and be a bigger power. You have France doing the same thing, Britain doing the same thing. That's what they're saying.
When did that start? When did that start? That started after 2022.
Fair enough, it did. But what happened prior to 2022? That's the part that we're just unwilling to consider. It's action, reaction. That actually is what I've been talking about from the beginning. You take action, the other side will take reaction, and vice versa. We've got to get off of this escalation ladder.
Agree.
Colonel, just back to the point of an Article 5 like security guarantee for Ukraine. How is that a threat to Russia? I'm not talking about putting long-range missiles in Ukraine, just purely a security guarantee. I just don't. I see that this is a fair compromise for Ukraine if Ukraine is going to give up territory to have a military.
But look at the reality of that. If we're not willing to fight a war against Russia right now, why does anyone think that we're going to be willing to fight one later? I mean, it's just illogical to say that we would later on go to when we haven't been up to this point. And why would it be in the interest of any European country, America, Poland, I mean, anybody, to go to war against Russia because of Ukraine when they themselves are not at threat? The only way they get a threat is if they go into a war against Russia. Russia is not planning on going to war against any other NATO country, whatever anyone may say, because they don't have the capacity, and they have said nothing besides, and Putin reiterated just 24 hours ago, they have no intention of doing that. And don't take him at his word. Fair enough. People say things all the time. Look at the capacity. They are getting ready right now, in my view, if there's a war against NATO, because of what NATO is saying and the fact that there are German troops in the Baltics, etc. They keep talking about moving forward. They would be foolish not to prepare. But there's no evidence that Russia would even want to go to the West. What possible benefit would they have to conquer territory when they are self-contained in their own country with natural resources, with energy, all the things that they need? They don't need to go out anymore. And prior to 2014, there was no evidence that they had any intention to even have their military at a bigger point. All of this started off that point, and then now that we keep having this, and that's where we are today. And if we don't get off of this, everyone is going to lose.
I'll let you respond, and then the final.
Okay,
go ahead, sir.
I was going to say that the irony.
I'll let you respond to all of them, General, and I'll ask you a final question as well, and I'll ask that last question to Colonel as well. Where do you see this war EU from now? That will be the final question after you respond as well.
So I think the place where Daniel and I are going to continue to disagree is on the inevitability of Russia winning, or that Ukraine could somehow be able to stop that. And clearly, that depends on the West. That depends on the West providing what's needed. And the best way to make sure that there is no war between Russia and Europe is that Ukraine is able to successfully defend itself. We need to help Ukraine become like Finland. There's a reason the Soviet Union and then Russia never attacked Finland again, even though Finland only has 5 million people and enormous borders, because they are armed to the teeth and they have the ability to mobilize very quickly with very well-trained forces. They have a resilient society, and they have a very good defense industry. That's what we need to help Ukraine become indigestible. And not one American, not one German, not one Polish, not one Finnish soldier ever has to die if we help Ukraine defend itself. That ought to be our policy. That ought to be our strategic approach. That ought to be our strategic end state. The Russians are not going to mess with Finland, even though Finland only has 5 million troops for those reasons. And we need to help Ukraine become like Finland.
Colonel, where do you see this in a year from now?
Well, in a year from now, one of two possibilities. When you look at how military forces operate when they're being attacked on the downside, you have two different possibilities. One is like the British and French in May 1940, when the Germans broke in there and they ended up penetrating in Sedan or whatever, a lot of complications, but bottom line, they got armor behind it, and it turned it into a panic and a rout, and the whole force just collapsed and literally a month later was rolling out of Dunkirk, etc. That's one thing. Then you have the image of the German soldiers in World War II that even though the war was clearly lost, especially after Kursk in 1943, and then all the time after that, everything was going down. Then the West started, joined against it. Clearly, the Germans were never going to win that war, but they would not stop, and their troops kept fighting. And they fought all the way until they were literally destroyed in Berlin. So it could be either one of those, and you never know which way it's going to be. The Ukraine army could collapse at some point just because they get too weak. They could calculate that it's no point in resisting, and they could stop, or they could go all the way down to Kiev. So it could be that a year from now, Russia has continued to move up to the Dnieper River, or it could be that the Ukraine army collapses. But there's not a scenario where this gets turned around, and this is so important to understand. It is illogical to say, given the inputs, I know what has happened in history, but history is a guide only. You have to look at the conditions that exist right now. Russia has the defense industrial base that the Ukraine and the West side can't match within years from now, even if they went to full decision to mobilize now. They haven't. The manpower continues to deteriorate on the Ukraine side, and it's not going to reverse. The Russian side continues to advance and accelerate. There is no fundamental rational basis to suggest that this is going to get stopped, whether the Russian side has damage on its economy or not. They will make calculations, and they will suffer like they have been many times, because it is an existential struggle for them. So it is theoretically possible something could happen, but there's no physical evidence to base that off of. So to base a policy on the hope that something gets reversed is to condemn Ukraine to complete death. It won't be an ugly deal. There will be no deal. It will be Russia just saying, here's the surrender terms. That's what I fear could happen between now and a year from now.
Lieutenant General, thank you so much for your time, gentlemen. I appreciate it.